Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to start our lecture series on the antebellum period in America. Particularly, we're going to be focusing on the antebellum South. So the first thing you got to understand is what antebellum means. It just means pre-war, but it's come to mean in America pre-Civil War. So we're going to use it in that context. So it's the time period before the Civil War started. Um, there are, the big issue is most definitely slavery and the expansion of slavery. As we've expanded the last lecture series, we kind of expanded the territory that America controls. And because of that, there's this huge debate about how that territory is going to become states. And when that territory becomes states, do those states enter the union as free or slave? There's a balance in the Congress, in the United States Senate, between free states and slave states. And everybody kind of wants to keep it that way. Everybody's afraid that the other side might, become more powerful, and that could be disastrous for their cause. And so, the North doesn't want slavery to expand, and so they don't want those states to enter as slave states, because then those slave states will then pass laws that will help expand slavery. The South doesn't want those territories to become free, because they're afraid that the North would pass laws that would end slavery everywhere. And so there's this real kind of contentious debate. The different sides have different views about the legality of slavery. The South kind of had this view that the territories belong to the whole nation, and denying slavery there or denying their constitutional rights. And so they believe that the states have the ability to choose whether they want to be slaves or not, or slave states or not. The three-fifths compromise in the Constitution does actually kind of in a tangential way does support slavery. And so it recognizes that there are slaves without explicitly saying that each state has the right to determine whether or not they want slaves. And so the South says they should all get to pick, and if they want to have slaves, they should be able to have slaves, and the individuals in the states also have the right to own slaves. And so they think that even the states shouldn't be able to deny an individual the right to be able to own slaves. Now, the North has a different view of this. The North believes that Congress has the right to pass laws that govern the territories, and that Congress has the right to restrict slavery if it sees fit. Now, there are some moderates here. And so we are going to see that there are people that do believe, that there's a more democratic way to solve these issues. And they believe that that would essentially boil down to popular sovereignty. Let the people vote. And so there are moderates out there that talk about squatter sovereignty, but that's really popular sovereignty. And that just means let the people vote on it, and then once the people vote, the state can pass laws that say we're either a slave state or a free state. This is going to cause some problems later, particularly in Kansas, which will become known as bloody Kansas. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. The two biggest supporters of the popular sovereignty movement are going to be Lewis Cass. Cass is a senator from Michigan. He's going to kind of be forgotten by history, because it's going to be Stephen Douglas who will, run against Abraham Lincoln for the Senate seat in Illinois. Or I'm sorry, Abraham Lincoln will run against Stephen Douglas. And the popular, the super famous Lincoln Douglas debates are all going to be about this issue: should the people be able to vote on slavery or not? Popular sovereignty. Now, we are going to see that there are going to be some attempts by anti slavery Northerners to try and abolish slavery. One of those is the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso is this guy right here, David Wilmot, who's from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is clearly one of the states that is most opposed to slavery. And the what Wilmot does is he passes a law, the law that gets called the Wilmot Proviso, that essentially is going to prohibit slavery from any of the land that we took from Mexico. Well, I mean, look, slavery in the North is not economical, right? And so the idea that, places like Oregon are going to end up being slave states, there's zero chance of that. It just doesn't make financial sense. And so, the areas where slavery is financially viable are in the South, which is the area that we took from Mexico. And so this is a direct shot at the slave states. It's, hey, all that land that we just took from Mexico, which is prime slave territory, we're not going to allow you to expand there. And that would essentially box in the South. They wouldn't have room to expand, which means they wouldn't be able to maintain the balance in the Senate. And so, the Southern states really view this as an attack against them. They believe that this is, the North trying to just enforce its will on the South. And they view it as a direct threat to slavery, which honestly, it probably is. Now, the Southerners, because of the balance, are going to be able to block this. So it's not going to actually come to fruition. We're not going to see the Wilmot Proviso pass. But this is just one more thing that the South is going to view as an attack on their way of life. They think, hey, North, if you don't want slavery, fine, don't have slavery. But don't stop us from doing what we're doing down here, is their kind of mentality. In the North, they don't really view it as enforcing their will on the South, although that is kind of what they're doing. They view it as just a humanitarian issue, that this is, we have to stop the spread of slavery because the spread of slavery is evil and we're a democracy, and, we have that obligation. And so, but the South views it as an attack. So the Antebellum South, the social structure, you got to understand the social structure of the South if you're going to understand slavery, because it makes no sense that in a democracy that the average Southerner would support slavery. It just doesn't make sense, because the uber elite, right? Very few people in the South actually own slaves. I mean, like the maybe doctors and lawyers made enough money to own one slave, right? And so how many doctors? There's not very many people rich enough to actually own slaves. It's like the elite landowners that own the majority of the slave, the planters that would own, hundreds of slaves. And so the average person in the South didn't own slaves and didn't benefit from slavery. As a matter of fact, the average person in the South was hurt by slavery, because if you're just a regular white person in the South, you find it very difficult to find work because all the work is being taken up by slaves. And so it hurts you economically to support slavery. But because we're a democracy and the people vote, you have to have the average white person in the South support for slavery for it to exist. So the question then becomes, well, why is it that these poor white people, middle class white people, average white people would support slavery in the South when it actually hurts them economically? And it has to do with the social structure, right? Because there are a few things out there in life that humans value more than money, right? And one of those things is social status. I mean, you see people all the time going broke trying to impress other people. And so, it's that kind of thing that's at play here. And so at the top of the social structure, you have your planter aristocracy. This is the elite of the elite, the super rich. They own 20 or more slaves, sometimes up to hundreds of slaves. These guys are super, super, super wealthy. Then You've got your middle class, right? Not a very large middle class. Today, we think of the middle class as the majority of people out there, which it is, but not in the 1800s, not the antebellum period. The middle class is very small. It consists of like doctors and lawyers. It's the second sons of the planter aristocracy, right? The firstborn sons, they inherit the plantation. The second son, they went to college and got a degree in law or medicine or engineering or something along those lines. Maybe the upper echelons of the military, officer class, they might own one slave, right? Not a field slave, like a personal body servant, somebody to cook and clean and whatever. That's a very small portion of the population. Then the third level, right? So the people with the next amount of status are going to be poor whites. These are people that don't have any slaves, never have a chance of owning a slave because they're just not going to have enough money to be able to do that, and they're actually really poor. The poor in the South are very, very poor. There, a lot of them are subsistence farmers, which means their farm is just large enough to grow enough food to survive, which means in bad weather, that they're really struggling, and they're just it's just a really hard, bad life. And so they don't have a lot going for them. But the reason they support slavery is because of social status. Even though they have almost nothing going for them, they at least have status over slaves. And so that is ultimately why they will support slavery, is because it doesn't matter how poor they are, it doesn't matter how uneducated they are, at least they're not slaves. And so they have somebody to kind of look down upon and hold their nose up at. And we might think of that as ridiculous today, but that's a powerful motivation. It's a powerful motivation to feel superior to other people, and that's tragic. I don't support that, but it is something that we see all throughout history, which will motivate people. And unfortunately, it's going to be slavery cannot exist in the South if the poor white population in the South don't support slavery, right? They're the majority of voters. All those poor whites have the ability to vote, and they could vote out slavery if they wanted to. They won't because they get to feel superior. It's the only chance they have at feeling superior, and so they're gonna clutch onto that. Not only in the period before the Civil War, but they're going to go fight, kill and die to hold on to that sense of superiority. And then they're even going to see later, after the Civil War, when slavery is ended, they're going to clutch onto that idea that they're superior all the way up through the Jim Crow South and into the 50s and 60s. So, why do most Southerners support slavery? Again, it's why do most Southerners support slavery? Well, that it's social status. It's the ability to feel superior to another group. Doesn't matter what that other group does, no matter how smart they are, how hard they work. Doesn't matter any of that. They will have status over that group of people, and that gives them a sense of superiority. So, the abolitionists and the slave owners both have different views of what slavery is like. The abolitionists are going to attack slave owners on a number of levels, right? They're going to attack slavery on a number of levels. They're going to say that the slave system of slavery breaks up marriages, which is true technically in most states in the South, and by the time we get to the area the time period right before the war, slaves aren't going to be allowed to get married. Now that's officially get married. They still will have religious ceremonies that will marry themselves, but that doesn't have any legal standing, because the slave owners will at times break apart these marriages when they sell slaves for different reasons. Slave owners will kind of encourage their slaves to develop relationships with each other and have these unofficial marriages, because that might end up in children, which means free slaves for them. And so that's an economic advantage to them. They also encourage those kind of relationships because it allows them leverage. One of the reasons why slavery works is, these plantations that might have 100 slaves on them are located out in the middle of nowhere in the South. And the white families that own these slaves are going to be, completely outnumbered. Well, how do you stop that large group of slaves from revolting? Well, you don't just punish the people that are maybe willing to revolt, you punish the people they care about. So the more connections each slave has with somebody that they love, the more that these slave owners can manipulate that. And so, it's even though these marriages get broken apart and bad, they are at least semi encouraged in the South. The idea of selling children to make a profit is abhorrent. And so the abolitionists will oppose that. They're going to oppose the working conditions for slaves in the South and slaves that get worked to death. That doesn't happen as often as I think it gets portrayed in like movies and stuff, because it's sensationalized when we see it in movies. Most slave owners don't want to work their slaves to death because it's an economic investment. You spend a lot of money on that slave, and if you kill them, then they can't work to make you a profit. And so what you see is this, with as far as the work goes, is you see this like brutal calculation being made. The That slave owners want to keep their slaves alive as long as possible until the cost of keeping them alive is more than the cost of buying another slave. And so if you're 20 and a slave, you're going to get fed. Now, you're going to get fed crappy food, right? You're going to get fed inexpensive food because they're trying to make profits as high as possible. So the food's going to be bad, but you're going to get food, and you're going to get the minimum amount of shelter and clothing, although the clothing situation is bad. And you might even get some sort of treatment if you get injured or whatnot, because the cost of that, there's going to be, the average slave lives to be about 35, a couple years younger than what the average poor white is in the South. And so the slave owner wants you to get to that 35, because if you're 20, they got 15 more years of labor. So it's economically viable for them to spend money on food and potentially even a little bit of medicine and whatnot to keep you alive to 35. Now, if you get injured or sick at 33 and they expect that you're probably going to die in a couple of years, then they probably won't. They'll just say, hey, we're going to work you until you die. So the working slaves to death idea, yeah, that does happen. But it is definitely more complicated than that. There's this, like I said before, immoral and absolutely brutal monetary calculation made about, how hard do you work somebody, how much food and medicine do you give them, and it all boils down to the bottom line. They'll spend money on you as long as it's cheaper to keep you alive than it is to buy a new slave. And then in some cases, in some areas, you see the life expectancy much lower. So, like, slaves down in the Delta in Louisiana, and then down into Cuba on like sugarcane plantations, the life expectancy there for slaves can be like 7 to 10 years. It's really incredibly low, and it's mostly because of malaria. The mosquitoes there are spreading malaria, and so you just, if you're down there long enough working in the swamps, which sugarcane grows in that kind of area, you're probably not going to live very long. And so what a lot of slave owners will do is they will work their slaves until they're getting kind of expensive, and then they'll sell those slaves downriver to the sugarcane plantations. That's why we have that phrase today, oh, when somebody like does you wrong, or like does something that like rats you out or something, and you say that, oh, he sold me downriver. That is a reference to slavery. That, oh, he did something bad to me, sold me downriver. Because for slaves, being sold downriver to the sugarcane plantations was essentially a death sentence. And so abolitionists pointed all this out and how brutal and terrible it is. And then I think probably one of the worst things that happens because we banned the importation of slaves in 1808. So this is a consequence of what abolitionists kind of wanted was, hey, let's stop kidnapping slaves from Africa, which clearly kidnapping slaves from Africa is bad. So, people without a lot of forethought outlawed that practice, and then the demand for slaves increased. So then, how do you get more slaves if you can't get them from Africa? Well, you breed them. And so, in the South, what we're going to see is a system of what is essentially institutionalized rape. Right? If you're a woman that has a anatomy that is indicative of success at childbearing, then you could end up essentially just they'll bring in one of the bigger, stronger field hands and force the two to have sex, wait 9 months till you have a baby, and then repeat that process over and over again. Well, that's devastating to the female body, just staying pregnant for 10, 12, 13 years. And so, I mean, essentially a lot of these women will die from the byproduct of just being pregnant all the time. And so abolitionists are pointing that all that stuff out. There's 100 different reasons why slavery is evil. The brutality of the beatings, which again, those beatings, the whipping and things like that is common, particularly for if you're trying to run away, or if you any kind of behavior that challenges the authority of the plantation system. But a lot of times in the movies we see slave owners chopping off legs or chopping off feet or hands. That did happen, particularly if you ran away too many times, to set an example. But again, those kind of extreme kind of punishments were always made in calculation to the monetary investment, right? You chop off somebody's foot, they're not going to be able to work for you as much, and so that becomes an issue. Now, the whippings on the other hand, you lash somebody, and brutal lashings happened. They could within a couple days get back to work, even though sometimes they were whipped, to just the edge of death and beyond on occasion. What happened. So, the abolitionists are going to point all this out. Now, the slave owners in the South are going to make an argument for slavery. And until we get books like Uncle Tom's Cabin that really expose the bad side, a lot of Northerners are, because they never see slavery. We live in a world with, back then, without social media, without television, and without those things. And so, the message that the South sends about slavery, a lot of people in the North are going to actually believe it until we get books like Frederick Douglass's autobiography or Uncle Tom's Cabin. They're going to argue that masters are decent, that they're Christian, and that they take their slaves from Africa that are, heathens because they're not Christian, and convert them to Christianity. So they actually make an argument that they're doing God's work, which mind blowing, right? They're going to say that slaves are content. And what they mean by that is a couple of things. One, that they're not as evolved as Americans are, as the Southerners are, and so they're content kind of just working all day and having that kind of simple life. They're also going to argue that they're content because they understand their place, that there is a hierarchy in the South, a rigid hierarchy in the South, and that slaves know how they need to behave, and they don't have to like navigate some unvocalized hierarchy like they do in the North, right? The North, the slave owners will say the North says they're this bastion of freedom, but then they don't actually treat African Americans the same. And so African Americans don't know how to act and behave in the North. And that causes strife. There's truth in that statement that there are, it's complicated. The hierarchies in the North are much less clearly defined, which makes it more difficult to know how to behave within that hierarchical system. But, certainly it's better than being a slave. And they're also going to argue that they're content because they don't have to worry about finding a job like you have to worry about in the North. They don't have to worry about a roof over the head. They don't have to worry about food on their plate. All of that is provided for them. If you're poor in the North, there's no social safety net in the North at this time period. There's no like welfare, there's no unemployment, there's no disability, there's nothing like that. And so if you're poor, every day is a battle to try and figure out how you're going to survive. And the South says, well, slaves don't have to worry about that. Well, we already talked about how that's not entirely true. If you're prime working age, yeah, you're going to get food on your plate. But if you're 34 and sick, is the slave owner going to invest in food and medicine and things that you need and a roof over your head and new clothes when you're getting close to the end of your lifespan? And the answer to that is most definitely no. So the one thing you notice, I hope you notice here, is that in what all the arguments that the South are making, these are all bogus arguments. But if you want to make the best bogus argument possible, you put a hint of truth in your propaganda, and that's what they're doing. Like, oh, they're Christians and they're converting slaves to Christianity, so aren't they good? Well, I mean, if you're Christian, you probably believe converting people to Christianity is good, but you're also forcing it through slavery, and so that's awful. And so the best lies always have a hint of truth, and you can see, I think you can see that in this situation. And like I said, slaves are living in conditions better than northern factory workers. And so when you take a look at what the conditions that northern factory workers are living in, they are absolutely living in terrible conditions. And so you could see this tenement house in the north. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6 people in this photograph. In generally speaking, in these kind of apartments, there's like no ventilation, no windows. You're going to the bathroom in a bucket. I mean, it's a horrible, disease-ridden, unsafe kind of place. And a lot of times, you got 6 guys sleeping there. A lot of times they're sleeping in shifts, and so the people working the night shift sleep during the day, and the people working the day shift sleep during the night. You do all that to split the rent, and it is horrible. But what the slave owners don't tell you is these people are free. They're earning money for their work. If they want to leave their job to get a better job to make more money, they can. And they're acquiring wealth. Although these guys, I'll be honest with you, these guys, all these people here are probably going to, stay poor their whole life. What they're going to do is eventually they're going to get married and they're going to have kids. And they're going to, even though they're poor, they're going to be able to save up a little bit of money. And that little bit of money that they save up, they're going to be able to pass on to their kids. And so their kids, who are going to start out poor, are going to get a little bit of a head start because they saved money. And then those kids who start out poor might eventually they'll save a little bit more money and they'll break into the middle class. And when they break into the middle class, they'll save more money, then they pass that down onto their kids, and they will begin to create generational wealth, which is what we see in northern families. That's how we eventually get to a very solid middle class. If you're born into the middle class in the United States, you're probably either going to stay in the middle class or move up, right? And so most likely stay in the middle class. And so they're earning that acquired wealth. African Americans that are being enslaved, they don't get to do that. They're not building that generational wealth. And so that's why, after the Civil War is over, slaves they get their freedom, they start with nothing. Where poor people in the North, they at least have something. Right. And if they don't have anything, their relatives probably do, which is the situation because of slavery in the South. You're not going to see any African Americans have. And so, part of the reason why, the African Americans have such a hard time after the Civil War breaking into the middle class. And we'll talk about a large part of that has to do with the system of sharecropping, which ultimately ends up being, instead of legal form of slavery, it ends up being an economic form of slavery. And I'll explain what that means, later. So, in reality, slaves were overworked, no doubt about it. They're poorly clad, they have inadequate housing, they receive minimal medical care. And I think for, something that needs to be pointed out as well. They're not receiving an education. They're not receiving skills training, which poor whites in the North have access to, and they're not being able to, save wealth that they can pass on to future generations, which will help them get into the middle class. So, what the South uses to justify slavery, we understand today is absolutely bogus. So the South has some definite fears about emancipation. One, they're afraid of racial mixing. There's no doubt about it. The South is really portrays African Americans, particularly African American men, as unable to control their sexual urges. And so you'll see in a lot of the propaganda, and even after the Civil War in movies like A Birth of a Nation, you're going to see this. Meme being pushed that if African American men have freedom, they're just going to like run around and be raping and pillaging the area, and so they're going to make an argument that African Americans need to stay enslaved to protect white women from black men. I mean, clearly that's ridiculously bogus. They're going to make an argument that there'll be an increase in crime rates, which we know doesn't happen. I mean, this is amazing. After the slaves are freed, they're literally a slave on Monday and free on Tuesday, and they have nothing, no money saved up, no support system, nothing. And you would think, man, if you have nothing, aren't you more likely to go out and commit crimes like stealing to be able to have something just so you'd survive? I would, right? Well, we see that doesn't actually happen. So the idea that crime rates are going to go up is bogus, but it is something that the South is promoting. They're going to be afraid of the change in social status. So we talked about that with poor Southerners, how they believed, that they would lose their social status. We know there are free slaves in the South. There are free African Americans in the South, and quite a bunch of them will make it into the middle class and have status over these poor Southern whites, and they're not going to like that. They're also afraid of losing political status. There's certain states like South Carolina, that there's a larger slave population than free population, and so they're afraid if we free the slaves that all of a sudden the freed slaves are going to take over the political system and then take that out on the white population, Southern white population. So they have that fear as well. And they're afraid of the ending of the plantation system, which has made the wealthy in the South extremely, extremely wealthy. And I do mean extremely wealthy. So those are fears of emancipation. The There are other concerns about emancipation too, which we actually historically can look back on and recognize that we got it wrong. We Because there was no real plan for emancipation, we just freed everybody at one time without regard to how to help these freed African Americans. What we're going to see is that's going to leave African Americans vulnerable to the economic manipulation of sharecropping. And so, we are going to have things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which is going to try and help African Americans with, basic support and to help to get jobs. But it's just not going to be enough for the 4 million people that are literally have nothing. Not like poor people today that have acquired things and at least some money and skills or an education. I mean, literally, these freed slaves will have nothing, and that's just going to leave them vulnerable. And so no doubt about it, we got it wrong. The emancipation, we should have thought about it more, but unfortunately, we didn't. So people have some concerns about the economic effect of slavery. The one the slavery was bad for the South. It benefited a few people. Ultimately, we know now that we could have ended slavery much earlier, and the Southern economy would have been probably better than what it was. It It perpetuated a class system in the South that trapped not just slaves, but the majority of poor Southerners, trapped them in what essentially was poverty. And so slaves definitely had it the worst, right? But even the majority of the Southern citizens, Southern whites, are going to be trapped in the lower classes because of slavery. We also know that the people who had money in the South failed to invest in businesses because you could just make a killing buying more land and more slaves. And so the South won't have the manufacturing. It's not going to have the infrastructure that the North has. The North, if you want to make money, you have to be innovative. You have to start a business and make something new and make it well and make it cheap, so people can afford to buy it. I don't mean cheap in the sense that it falls apart. I mean inexpensive. So you have to make a product well, and it has to be inexpensive. In the South, none of that happened. As a matter of fact, business, like the wealthy, disdained business. They thought gentlemen owned plantations because really those rich men that owned these plantations, they didn't do any work. They hired people to do it for them. They hired overseers to do it for them. They spent their days kind of pursuing, leisurely activity. And, businessmen can't do that. They got to get their hands dirty and do all that kind of stuff. And so you created an entire society in the South that kind of actually disdained work. Right. And so the other thing that it does is slavery limited the population in the South. When immigrants came into America, why would they ever go to the South? Are there jobs in the South? No, of course not, because the slaves have them. So where did all the immigrants go? They went to the North. That's where jobs were, because people had to create businesses to create wealth in the North. That means they had to have workers. So when immigrants came in, they came into the North because that's where the jobs were. Now, fast forward to when the Civil War breaks out. Which side had businesses and factories that could make guns and boots and all those types of things? The North did. Which side had a large population because it had sustained immigration going to it? The North did, right? And so slavery essentially is going to doom the South to losing the Civil War because they don't have the infrastructure to be able to win it, right? The North has a ton of businesses. To connect those businesses, you have to have railroads. So which side had more railroads to be able to move supplies and troops around during the war? The North did, right? I mean, it's just over and over. The economic effects of slavery are going to set the South up for failure in the Civil War, which is a good thing because that means, no more slavery in America. And then that says produce contempt for manual labor. We had talked about that already. So the South has a series of codes or laws that govern the way that the South, can treat slaves. Each state had kind of different sets of slave codes, but there are certain themes that are, kind of run through all of them. One, the slave owner has the right to compel a slave to work. You can't say no. So if you don't work, they can punish you. And essentially, that punishment is left up to the slave owner on how they want to do that. All the products of that labor belong to the slave owner and not the slave. So the slaves can't own property. Anything they own is actually the property of the slave owner. They can't testify against white people in court, which essentially means that, for a slave to be punished for something, all they need is an accusation against them from a Southerner, and that's it. And they can't make contracts, and that makes sense. They can't make contracts because if they, when you make a contract between you and another person, then that can for that what that does that's a legal document. And so if slaves can make contracts, they can use those contracts to hold it over their slave owners' heads, and the whole system of slavery falls apart there. One of the problems with all of these, there's lots of problems with it. I mean, moral, all kinds of problems with it. But one of the things that you'll see happen is some slave owners will tell slaves that, hey, look, you're going to work for me for 12 hours a day. What you do in your free time is up to you. And if you want to go and earn side money doing something else, I'll let you do that. And if you save up enough money, $800 or whatever it is, then I'll let you buy your freedom. You may take a handshake, shake hands. And so some slave owners would do that and they would honor that promise. You give me $800, all right, you're free. You write out a little receipt and send you on your way. Uh, but a lot of slave owners, the slave would work all this extra work, come in and say, I have the $800. And the slave owner just takes that $800 and says, sorry, you're still a slave, and walk away. What can that slave then do, even though he was promised his freedom for that money? Well, that slave can do nothing because of the slave codes. There's no contract. There's nothing a slave can do to hold the master to their word. And then marriages aren't recognized because once you allow people to get married, then all of a sudden that can cause problems if the slave owner wants to sell slaves, or then is the child of that marriage the property of the slave owner or not? And so there's just marriages not recognized, even though they happened still. Right, they were slaves were married before God, but that wasn't a legal marriage. Slave labor. Most slaves were field workers, but some would end up being skilled craftsmen. And so you see that some will like skilled craftsmen, like cord tweeners or blacksmiths, and then some were domestic posts too. The if you were big and strong, you're definitely a field hand, but children and women worked out in the field as well. That was the hardest work to be done. The domestic help a lot of times were the lighter skinned slaves. A lot of that was just because of racism, and it was believed the lighter skinned slaves were, and more intelligent and more trustworthy. Also, and this is they would never say this, but a lot of times the lighter skinned slaves were the children of the slave masters who had raped their slaves, and so to give their offspring, an easier job, they were brought in the house to work, and so that happened as well. Right. Material conditions for slaves. The average slave's lifespan was less than the lifespan of the average white. They're more likely to suffer from malnutrition, lose a child in infancy. Again, all of that is because of the cost cutting methods of the living conditions that the slave owners instituted, and because of the hard work that the slaves would have to do in terrible conditions. Their life expectancy was shorter than the average white at the time. The average white Southerner's life expectancy, however, was not long. Right. I mean, it was in their 30s. And so, I'm 39, so I would be pushing the end of my time. And that's, again, because of poverty and malnutrition and lack of medicine and medical care and whatnot. But slaves, clearly had it worse. Family life, slave sales constantly broke up families, which starts a tradition of reliance on extended family. And so even today, we kind of see the vestiges of this. Whereas like white families in America, the nuclear family is super important, but extended family like cousins and second cousins, a lot of times not as important. Whereas in African American families, extended family is vital, and so cousins are almost viewed like brothers, and sisters are viewed in white families. And a lot of that, it has to do with the vestiges of slavery, right? If your parents, the extended family became so important because if you're a kid and your parents got sold or you got sold, you would have to rely on an aunt or an uncle or a cousin to be able to help raise you. And so it really instills the importance of family in situations like that. The average slave lived to be around 35, and literally ran a 50-50 chance of being sold at least once in their lifetime. And so if you're sold, and you're coming into a new plantation, because there was so much selling, and a lot of times you're sold to a neighboring plantation or somewhere close, you probably had some sort of relative on that plantation that you could rely on, even if it was a distant relative. And that's why slaves forged these extremely strong family ties. They pinch my nerve in my neck. Which you'll still see, vestiges of today. the family structure is, for slaves, super important. And think about it. You're not allowed to really own anything. You work all day. You don't have a lot going on. Your slave owner might give you half a day off on Sunday to go to church. I mean, like you've got family and church, and that's the only thing the slave owners are really giving you. And so those two things become vital to your life. We will see resistance to slavery from the slaves themselves. About 200 attempts at rebellion were recorded. There were probably more than that, but around 200 are recorded. Really, none of them will be successful, and that goes to show you how absolutely repressive the system of slavery was. Some of these rebellions were really large scale. We talked about Nat Turner before. We'll hit on him again today in this lecture. And some of them would just be a single slave trying to get, some sort of revenge for, just being a slave or for treatment of a loved one or whatever. And a lot of them are going to be squashed even before they start. And that's because, the revenge that a slave owner will take on rebelling slaves was so brutal that a lot of times when slaves found out that there was a rebellion being planned, they would stop it themselves because they didn't want, their entire family to be punished. So we're going to talk about a couple examples of resistance here. The first we're going to talk about is Denmark Vesey. He's a slave on a ship, so he's a sailor who's going to earn money. Like, whenever the ship stops at port, he'll be able to use his free time to earn a little extra money to buy his freedom. And so he'll be able to do that, and he will save up enough money to buy his own freedom. Once he buys his own freedom, though, he's not able to save up enough money to buy the freedom of his family. And so when he becomes free, he actually sticks around in the South because he doesn't want to abandon his family. And that's why we see there is a free population of Black people, former slaves in the South, because they don't want to leave their family, even though it's incredibly dangerous, right? Any white person can show up and be like, "You're my slave," unless you could produce the documents, they could end your freedom. And even if you could produce the documents, sometimes they just rip it up and say, "Sorry, you're a slave now." So it's very dangerous, but you don't want to abandon your family. And so Denmark Vesey sticks around, becomes a leader in the African American church in the South, and uses the church connections to plan a plot. And he wants to seize control of the arsenal in Charleston. And so he thinks that if he can take over the arsenal, which is where they store weapons, while most whites were outside vacationing out of the city, that the slave population will rise up, get their guns, and then fight their way to freedom. This won't happen because a slave will find out about this and will tell the authorities that the rebellion is being planned. The leaders will be captured and hung, and Denmark Vesey will be hung with the other leaders. And so very famous plan doesn't come to fruition, and essentially gets put down right away. Now, Turner, on the other hand, very religious. He will lead a small group of slaves against his masters, the Travers family, very rich. Or I'm sorry, not Travers family is not very rich. They own slaves, so they've got money. But he's very religious. Nat Turner is very religious. He believes that God has chosen him to end slavery. And one night, one day there's an eclipse. He views that eclipse as a sign from God to rise up, kills the Travis family, convinces, once he kills the Travis family, he takes their guns and heads to the next plantation, and eventually convinces about 75 slaves to kind of move from plantation to plantation, killing the slave owners and freeing the slaves. It's brutal. They're going to kill not just like the overseers and the slave owners, but the wives and children. I mean, brutal stuff. But in an attempt to free slaves, eventually the local militia will come out. The South is terrified. They think all slaves are going to rise up. This is their worst nightmare. Situation like this ends up being one of the like most prolonged slave rebellions in the South. And so, the militia comes out and will essentially end up capturing 20 of his followers, hang them to be able to put down the rebellion. They're going to hang Turner and then skin them afterwards. Absolutely awful. And so, the revolt terrifies these slave owners and leads to a more restrictive South. They're going to, place stricter slave codes on the slaves in the South. They're going to place tougher restrictions on abolitionist literature that's coming into the South, and are going to be more resenting of the North for meddling in the South. And so, what we see is the tensions between the North and South at this point, since the Wilmot Proviso, have just been escalating. And so it's at this point we're starting to get closer and closer to irreconcilable differences and the Civil War. All right, that concludes our lecture for today. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you again shortly.